what is the root cause of the ongoing instability in the DRC, and how does Rwanda factor into this?
Well, Rwanda's involvement in the DRC really dates back 3 decades, which happens to also be the period when I started reporting on the Great Lakes. What you had in 1994, of course, was the genocide in Rwanda, in which members of the Tutsi minority were particularly targeted by the government army of the day in Rwanda and the extremist militias that were operating inside that country. And you have Paul Kagame, the current president, his rebel movement, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, seizing power, and this exodus of Rwandan Hutus, supporters of the government, some of them who had played a part in the genocide of 1994, flooding into neighboring Congo and forming these massive camps. And those camps represented a big security threat for the Rwandan government, a new government set up by Paul Kagame, for quite a few years. And then in 1996, the Paul Kagame's new army decided that they'd had enough of all these raids that were taking place across the border, these attacks by these coming from the refugee camps in eastern Congo. And they basically pulled together a Congolese rebel movement. They gave it a military backing, and it broke up. It went into eastern Congo, broke up those camps, chased down the extremists and the former army fighters amidst those forces. And then most of those refugees went back to Rwanda. But ever since then, what you've had is a series of interventions by Rwanda, often with Uganda joining in which they have intervened into Congo, taking advantage of the fact that the government in Kinshasa can sort of barely police that part of the world. And also taking advantage of the fact that Congo, as everyone knows, is a country that is rich in many things. It's rich in diamonds, it's rich in gold, it's rich in coltan, which is one of the strategic minerals we need for our mobile phones. It's also rich in timber, oil, rare animals, you name it, Congo has it. And Rwanda, which is a very small country, just 14 million people, a very poor country, most of its economy is actually made up of subsistence farming, so peasant farmers, and it's overpopulated, it's massively, intensely populated, has realized the advantages of having a presence in eastern Congo. So there's a mix of interest there. And what you've had is a series of rebel groups, which are usually dominated by members of the Tutsi minority from which Paul Kagame comes, challenging the government. Often these rebel groups are former members of the Congolese army who were supposed to be integrated, disarmed, retrained, integrated into the Congolese army. They then say they're not getting treated properly, their interests are not being respected. And then they turn against the Congolese government. And then it turns out that, surprise, surprise, Rwanda's army is heavily backing them. And this is what's happened recently with the M23, which is not a new rebel group, but it is a rebel group that had flared up in around 2012, and then had received a lot of backing from Rwanda at the time and had seized Goma briefly, the capital of North Kivu. But basically all of Rwanda's donors, its foreign allies, said, hang on, stop interfering in eastern Congo. And they cut off funding to Rwanda. And so the M23, strangely enough, just disappeared into the bush. Anyway, they returned 3.5 years ago. And the response of the Western community was very different this time. There were all sorts of reasons why people did not condemn this intervention in the same way as they had in 2012. What we saw in January and February was that the M23, backed up by about 6,000, 7,000 Rwandan troops, seized Goma in North Kivu, then went on to seize Bukavu, spread across, ended up controlling 2 of the key provinces of eastern Congo, North Kivu and South Kivu, and looked like they were turning their attention to Kisangani. But at that stage, things came to a grinding halt because the US intervened and said, that's enough, guys. We need to start negotiating peace terms. We can't just let this carry on. So that's where things stand at the moment. 2 provinces in the hands of the M23. This peace deal that you mentioned was signed on June the 27th. Rwanda and Congo both signed, their foreign ministers signed. In theory, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, and Felix Tshisekedi, his Congolese counterpart, will be turning up in Washington to also sign another deal at a summit. And we're also waiting to see another agreement, a business agreement, which is really going to give some substance, because Trump is a deal maker, and he's
a very transactional, president.
A transactional deal, win-win, in which both Congo, the DRC, and Rwanda will benefit economically. And so will a horde of US companies who, we are told, are waiting to invest in the region if only there is a guarantee of peace.
So I'm a bit skeptical about this because, the conflict in that region has been going on for a very long time. I recall even when I started as a journalist at SABC Africa, that was the area I was covering in my 20s. 20-something years down the line, there are more and more layers of complexity. I can't even keep up. If all it took to get stability was a better focus, a better use of the resources of the region, if all it took to gain some stability there was just hold on, guys, let's just sit down and talk. It just sounds too good to be true that you've got US business, you've got Donald Trump, who's transactional, we know that, and that his administration can just come in and bring these arch nemesis, these people who've had a historic beef, as it were, that this is all that it will take to bring stability?
Well, I share your skepticism, and many people do. And, we can go into the reasons why skepticism may be in order in a moment. I think one of the arguments I'm hearing from people is, yes, be skeptical, but give it a chance. Because one of the things they point out is this is the only deal on the table at the moment. There have been repeated meetings, there have been repeated conferences, there's been endless sort of peace programs, negotiations, mediation, much of it taking place in Africa over the last 3.5 years when the M23 re-emerged as a problem. And this is the best promise available at the moment. So what I'm hearing from diplomats in particular and analysts is like, let's give this one a chance because there's nothing else going on. And I think, the key factor in all of this is that it's the US that is involved. And like it or lump it, we all know that when the US gets involved, it can change things. African solutions to African problems has not delivered peace in Congo. God knows people have tried. There's been a whole series of talks that were being overseen by Angola, the Luanda process. There was a peace process going on in East Africa. There was, as you know, a South African coordinated regional peacekeeping force in position in Congo when the fighting broke out in January. Before that, there was an East African peacekeeping force. There's a United Nations peacekeeping force still in position. This time, the US is very directly concerned. And in a way, Trump's credibility is on the line. You'll have heard that he's hoping that he will win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he is touting Congo as one of the great successes that will win him, this Nobel Peace Prize.
I was just thinking about that. You just read my mind because his focus was on the Middle East, right?
Yes.
And that seems wobbly. And Netanyahu doesn't always listen to him. I know Netanyahu is in town. He's in Washington now. They sometimes have tension. And then the Iran situation didn't quite go on, turn out the way that Trump had hoped. So the irony, should his ambitions for a Nobel Prize be resting on an African problem?
And you didn't even mention Ukraine and Russia, where everything's supposed to be solved overnight. But strangely enough, it's turned out to be rather more complicated than that. But yes, Congo is one of the deals that he hopes to present as a massive success story. I mean, it was quite noticeable when he was giving his remarks in the Oval Office that he clearly had no idea what he was talking about. He barely knew where Congo was and had no grasp of the details of the conflict at all. But US involvement is going to be key to this. The reason that the US is interested is because what we know about Congo's mineral industry is it's dominated by China, and that the whole world, including the US, depends on China to provide it with the components that go into all our essential high-tech gadgets that we use. and that the US is unhappy about that dependence. So if 80% of Congo's industry is in Chinese hands at the moment, the US wants to have a bigger presence. And the Congolese are very, very happy to grant it a bigger presence if it means that they can tackle and deal with the problem of Rwanda's repeated military interventions in the east of the country.
Where does that put Africa? I mean, you mentioned the South African-led peacekeeping force. There have been regional interventions. We have entered a new era of commercial diplomacy. The US is not even hiding it. That's exactly what they say is their strategy for engaging with Africa. Entering this new phase of a corporate incentive to maintain stability, not just in the DRC, but everywhere else. I'm just thinking about this corporate incentives and where does that put the citizens? What would be the best deal? Not just a conversation between the corporates and the political class, but people, I imagine, are exhausted. There are probably generations of people who have never known stability and peace in the DRC itself, in Rwanda and the DRC in relation to each other. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the criticisms being leveled against this deal by people who are in Congo, including, for example, Denis Mukwege, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's that surgeon from Eastern Congo. He comes from Bukavu, one of the cities that is now in M23 control. And he's saying this is effectively rewarding aggression because the deal doesn't even use the phrase Rwandan troops. It doesn't explicitly refer to the fact that Rwanda invaded Congo. It uses this wonderful euphemism that Rwanda commits itself to the lifting of defensive measures. That's, the equivalent of Putin referring to the invasion of Ukraine as, a military operation or a specific, I can't remember his phrase, but that's Rwanda's equivalent, the lifting of defensive measures, which effectively means 6,000, 7,000 troops going into Eastern Congo, taking with them drones and anti-aircraft missiles, all sorts of sophisticated new weapons that Rwanda has recently been on a massive, the last few years, it's been on a massive shopping spree around the world to get the latest in technology. And it's been using all that technology to invade Eastern Congo, and all of that's referred to as defensive measures. Yes, so one of the problems that people like Denis Mukwege are pointing out is, what about the human rights angle? We know that there was a mapping report done by the United Nations in 2010, in which they found that Rwandan-supported rebels and Rwandan troops were responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in Eastern Congo. And the violence has just continued since then. That 617 different atrocities were listed in that report. And Mukwege is saying, what about justice? What about reparations for the victims? What about a human rights element to this deal? So he takes he's fiercely objecting to it. And he's saying it's an opaque deal. It's not transparent, and it hasn't consulted the people most directly affected, which is the Congolese citizens who have experienced violent sexual rape, looting, forcible conscription into both sides, both the Congolese militias, but also the M23. The children have been recruited, child soldiers has always been a problem in that part of the world. They've been displaced again and again. If you read the reports, hundreds of thousands of people living in tents, all the diseases the spreading of diseases that goes with that. And all of that is supposed to be sort of neatly forgotten as we just focus on transactional peace deal premised on business interests. But again, I'm sure my diplomat friends and analyst friends will say, if it can work and if it can give peace, then those people will benefit, give peace a chance. I think in Africa, what I've learned over the decades is that it does all boil down to politics. So when people try and do business and ignore the politics, they find themselves ending up becoming very, very interested and focused on the politics. So I think you can't divide the two. And I think the people who will try to deliver this peace are going to discover that. And one of the points that the Congolese foreign minister has been making, Therese Wagner, who was there at the signing in the Oval Office, she said the US has to remain involved in this. They have to police it. Part of the deal caters for a joint verification mechanism, and that is basically a committee, as far as I can understand it, which will involve the African Union, Qatar, which has played a big role as mediator, and the Americans. And the idea is they're going to be overseeing the various steps that are supposed to take place and then reporting back if those steps are not undertaken. And she said,
it's important that we emphasize it, because sometimes, I criticize US foreign policy, and we must. Everybody must be critiqued and criticized that the US is interfering. It's not. That's what the parties, the signatories to this deal are saying, that remain involved because there's no trust between them. They've had it's historic. They need somebody outside to oversee. They're inviting the US as well.
Yes.
Let's just